introduce yourself, please, and tell us what you're up to.
Sure. I'm Red Hat's Vice President of Global Public Policy. Spend a lot of my time thinking about how to work with governments on a variety of issues affecting technology, and particularly open source. Prior to joining Red Hat, I was Senior Vice President of a large association of software companies, and even before that, I was a senior official at the U.S. Department of Commerce working on innovation and technology. So it's great to be here at Red Hat, and thanks for doing this panel today.
Absolutely. David?
So my name is David Bray. I'm known as a human flak jacket and digital diplomat, otherwise known as the FCC CIO. And while I don't have a video, I arrived 3 years ago. There had been 9 CIOs in 8 years, which is always a good sign for CIO number 10, that things are just going swimmingly. And they had 207 systems, all on premise, consuming more than 85% of our budget, average age more than 10 years old. Less than 2 years later, everything is either a public cloud or commercial service provider, and as a result, instead of spending 85% of our budget, we're spending less than 50%. Even more importantly, instead of taking 6 or 7 months to stand up a new system, we can have a working prototype for you in less than 48 hours.
Rob Efrus. Hi, I'm Rob Efrus, founder and CEO of Efrus Federal Advisors, and I also serve as president of the Coalition for Enterprise Open Source in Government, formerly with NASA, and a staffer on the Hill.
Excellent. Thank you all for that. And I'm Adam Clater. I'm Red Hat's Chief Cloud Architect for the Public Sector Organization. And fortunately, I have the easiest job today. I just have to moderate this panel with gentlemen who are absolutely incredible. It's an honor to be on stage with all of you. So we've had a bit of a history lesson of open source in the federal government from a couple of our speakers today, which I think has been great. What would you say, and we'll start with Mr. Bohannon, what would you say is the state of open source from your perspective within the government today?
So I think the state of open source and the appreciation of open source is actually very good, if not outstanding and awesome. I remember 20 years ago as a government lawyer, to some degree still recovering from that. I remember the first day 20 years ago when something open source came across our desk. We thought aliens had landed from Mars. I think we're way obviously beyond that now. We're past, as Mike laid it out very well, 10 years ago, we were trying to explain it's okay to use it. So the question was whether to use it. Today, I think it's about how to use it. How can it help you? How are we implementing it? I think we're in a much different chapter these days.
And David, the FCC was a very early adopter of open source. Tell me about that journey.
Sure. So we did. It had already been adopted prior to my arrival, and when I arrived, it was one of the things we accelerated. One of the things that we did when I arrived was we had been previously paying for volunteers to be willing to share their broadband connection speed. That was about $4 or $5 million a year. We wanted to see if we could crowdsource it and have an app that people could download to their phone, and if they download it to their phone, monitor their broadband connection speed. But you can imagine in late 2013 saying, hi, I'm with the US government. Would like to download an app that'll monitor your broadband connection? May not get a huge uptake, even if you played a nice motivational mission video. But that said, what we did was we made the code open source, and we actually had terms and conditions that were only 2 pages long. And when was the last time you ever signed up for anything on the internet? But by making it open source, those could go onto GitHub that wanted to and see that by design we weren't capturing your IP address. By design, we didn't know who you were in a 5-mile radius. And so they actually said in their code they've actually baked in privacy by design. And as a result, that got public trust and resulted in it being the 4th most downloaded app right behind Google Chrome. So I think actually what needs to be said, because I agree that open source has been well talked about, there's a huge support base in the US government. I think the bigger conversation is how you can use open source to actually get trust, because you're now exposing what your code or your algorithm is doing, what is being done with the data, and that's necessary because really we need to think about government as a 20th century term. And instead, we need to talk about public service. How many of you would be willing to share data on air quality, water quality, transportation quality, if it would make your community safer, if you knew that the data was kept private and anonymous? Well, the way you can do that is by making open source what's being done with the data and the algorithm. And I think that's the real value of open source that we're just beginning to scratch the surface on.
Now, David mentions trust. And I think part of trust is knowing that you're getting something you can build a mission on that can run for quite some time. And I know that's a lot of the concerns that are bandied about with CEO SSG. So from your perspective in the commercialization of open source, where are we today and where are we going?
There's a very, as many of you know, very healthy ecosystem of enterprise open source vendors doing business with federal agencies, all of whom have their roots in the community-based open source movement. What's worth noting, however, is that the enterprise vendors invest their capital to ensure that their versions are supportable, meet all federal security requirements, and can be maintained over the long term. And we've been in discussions with groups like the US Digital Service and 18F and other major stakeholders and proponents of open source to make sure that there's an awareness that free isn't necessarily free, and that in making a decision to go open source as a COTS offering, there needs to be a consideration of what the commercial marketplace has to offer in terms of those open source solutions supported by enterprise vendors.
And I actually want to build on that because I think that is so key. I recognize there may be some that disagree with me in government, but I'd actually say that for most things that we do, we should not be coding. We are not in competition. I understand that code is secret sauce, and that makes sense. Now, we should be working with commercial partners that maybe are using open source and are hosting it for us, but if we customize code, that's all well and good until 5 or 6 years from now. And now you've got to go back and figure out the changes you made, maybe something's been broken, maybe a new patch has come out and it broke things. That's how we are currently in the state where we are right now, which according to reports, upwards of 75–80% of budgets for IT budgets for US government are being spent on just maintaining systems. Some cases, you've got cases where agencies are 90% or more. And so I recognize that there may be some that signed up for public service thinking they were going to be coding. I still think there's a place for you, but it really should be more about stitching together API calls across different microservices or modules, but not actually diving into the engine and actually trying to write code itself. I think there's enough that you can find that you can almost stitch together as pieces of a quilt, as opposed to build a piece of the quilt yourself.
3,400 individuals supporting Fortran and COBOL code in the civilian federal government is not a good thing.
Is Fortran open source?
Well, it may be, but I think what you're really saying is that being a software company is hard, right? Red Hat has 10,000 people being a software company. That's a very hard task to do. Something we excel at, right? And it's something that maybe the government should leave to industry, right?
Well, I mean, I think our two things is one, when people say like government should be run like a business, I often say, what business would you know where the budget is actually being set by a completely different organization of 535 people that, you know, the mission of public service is about delivering the mission, not ROI. I mean, that's nice to think about, but you really don't want public service thinking about making a profit off of delivering the mission. It's about delivering the mission first and foremost. And so I think that's where there are great alignments when we can align the public sector and the private sector and recognize that the private sector will do several things great, which includes running cloud services, running microservices, and have that be available. We will be great at integrating it at the point of mission where it's necessary. And I think that's what we need to really talk about in terms of public service. And that's why I say I think the word government is increasingly an outdated word. Packet latency in the 1770s was 3 days, and that was on horseback. Not the case anymore. Now we're talking about milliseconds. And so really thinking about now that we are getting to the point where we can count on the internet pretty much always being there. Maybe there's some austere environments where we have to go dark for a while. So we do need to have the ability to actually deal with DoD and imagine other national security missions have that need. What can we do that can actually remix services from the private sector to serve the public sector mission?
Absolutely. So I think another big part of this entire transformation has really been cultural. Right? There's a new culture within Washington, D.C. and within the federal government about being open, and Paul alluded to some of that. Mark, can you start off for me and just talk to me about what the cultural changes that we're seeing throughout the government with default to open, digital services, those types of activities?
Sure. Certainly compared to when I was in government, I mean, we're talking about much more open. And I was chief counsel for one of the national labs, which was very open in working with industry. But I think that, you know, today it's an assumption that you're going to be doing everything in a way that is not, if not overtly transparent, then you better be prepared for it to be transparent, whether you want it or not. And I think that that has shifted a lot of things, for good and bad. I want to be very clear about that. But I do think that there is now this assumption, and it started even before the current administration, this default to open. This is not just a kind of, you know, we got to put in item 13 into the list. Default to open is about actually doing things in a more collaborative way, quite frankly, one of the major lessons from the commercial sector. So I see that the openness, I think it does present challenges about how you manage things, about how you make judgments. But in the end, I think it's about getting new ideas, new innovations, new technologies into government in a way that certainly when I was there, it was just much, much more difficult to do.
Right. Rob, how about you?
I would say culturally, one of the greatest impediments, and this is meant as no disrespect to any acquisition professionals in the audience, but as the former speaker said, there are rocks that you pick up that you have to pick up. And in dealing with open source, one of the challenges that our members have identified involves a contracting workforce that is not necessarily trained on being able to differentiate in a context between free and supported software in the open source arena. And from a cultural standpoint, it is a very exciting time. The past 8 years, the past 12 months, as somebody who's been in the federal IT business for 25 years, has been one of the most dynamic and innovative that I've observed. But still, the constraints involving the federal acquisition regs and the acquisition personnel making decisions involving open source has a long way to go.
So I definitely want to echo on that, and actually first ask, if you're with a government agency, how many of you have adopted one open source cloud service in the last year? That gives you a sense. How many have done more than 4? Okay, so at the FCC, I think in the last sort of 20 months, we've done 14 different ones. It's possible, but you definitely have to work a good relationship with your procurement officer. But the question I have is, why are individual agencies trying to go it alone? If there are folks in GSA, I apologize by saying this, but I really think GSA needs to step up and have a schedule of a la carte cloud services, so that way we just need to buy into seats or consumption base, as opposed to having each organization try and do it itself. That just doesn't make sense to me. And maybe that's what, if you repivot what 18F is doing and they stop coding and actually focus on reusable cloud services, that would be a welcome gift to CIOs and CTOs around the entire public service.
So, I don't know how many of you know this. David is a cultural social engineer. He creates change within the FCC and throughout the government. So talk to me about the cultural change that you've had at the FCC and how that enabled you to go 100% cloud.
So parachuting in the FCC, again, I already gave you sort of the context of 9 COs in 8 years. Good sign for CO number 10. Everyone's looking at their watches to say how long I'm going to last. Fortunately, I'm not dead yet. But that was 3 years ago. The other thing was the average person had been at the FCC for 15 and a half years. The average contractor had been at the FCC for 19 years. So I recognize that if I'm going to make the jump to cloud, I'm going to have to actually get them to buy into doing it. It can't be something from top down. In fact, I had been in the past and worked in organizations that were top down, and 1, I never appreciated being micromanaged, and 2, I never appreciated the loss of autonomy. So I told them, I said, I'm going to give you 3 things. I'm going to give you autonomy, I'm going to give you measurable progress, which actually helps both them and me. If you feel like you're making progress at work, it's going to motivate you to do even more. And then finally, I'm going to give you a meaningful purpose, in which fortunately public service has in spades. And we're going to run it sort of like an internal venture capitalist fund, which is if you spot something that can allow us to accelerate our journey to going to 100% public cloud, the nice thing about that is I'm going to ask for 3 reasons why we should do it, but I'm also going to ask for 3 reasons why we should not, because oftentimes we do have constraints. Maybe there's a rule in place, a law in place, maybe a different bureau is going to feel like they're actually having their data taken away from them. However it is, we need to identify the 3 reasons why not, and then come back with 3 ways we're going to mitigate it. And so that shows second and third order thinking. And after that, then I'll invest in you. I'll give you 3 months, see what you can do. If you're going well, I'll give you another 6 months. No project itself is scoped beyond 3 months, just because the rate of change is so high. We'll make pivots along the way. But by empowering what I call change agents, and that's the change agent philosophy of basically a bottoms up, give them autonomy, give them measurable progress and a meaningful purpose, that actually allowed us to move at speed and in less than 2 years, move from everything on premise to public cloud and commercial service provider.
100%, which
100%.
That is an amazing accomplishment within the federal government. Like, thank you. So a small story about me. In the late 90s, when I was working at an unnamed agency, I installed Red Hat Linux on some old Sun equipment that I had because functionally there was no workstation for me at this agency. I plugged it into the network and had it up and running. It was working great and was accosted by security and told that if I didn't unplug that machine from the network, I would be thrown out of the building. So as we talk about culture, that was a time when innovation was not at all respected within the government, at least within that space. And now we expect innovation from our people. And that's what you were just talking about, David. So Mark, tell me about what you're seeing from an innovation perspective, and especially around the federal open source policy. Federal source code policy, I'm sorry.
Thanks, Adam. So you've asked me two questions. Let me try to take the second one first. Mike alluded to it, but there is a new federal source code policy that was released in August. Many of you have probably read about it, heard about it. I think what gets lost in the details is why this policy was adopted. And stunningly, even today, as we talk about agile, modular, reusable, federal government probably still spends, according to OMB, upwards of $5 billion on procuring custom-developed software. I mean, we're talking about the kind of software that was rampant in the federal government 20 years ago, was the basis of many legacy systems, really was at the heart of the problem of government off-the-shelf software, which COTS was then meant to address. So OMB began a process. They actually thought it was so important they put it as a priority for their open government partnership agenda. We were very lucky at Red Hat to be very blessed to be asked to help participate in some of the stakeholder meetings. And so this policy came out in August, and really its focus is how do we reduce even further the amount that's being spent on custom developed software. And it does two things. First of all, it reinforces use commercial off-the-shelf software, which includes open source first. I mean, make sure that you're looking at those alternatives. Secondly, even where you do decide to procure, and this is where the pilot program that's gotten reported in the media comes up, it is expected that agencies should open source at least 20% of that code over the next 3 years. Obviously, we'll see how that goes. I think it's going to be an interesting experiment. But remember that the purpose of this policy is it's time to quit procuring custom developed software, start using commercial solutions like open source, get back to the default open policy.
Right. Rob?
The members of our coalition were extremely jazzed about the release of this policy, specifically because it put in black and white the need for contracting officers in making a decision about open source to consider the life cycle costs of using that open source, whereas previously issues related to security, compliance, et cetera, were not necessarily factored into the decision. And so if you have a government developer, for example, developing a mobile security app, the costs associated with that as compared to procuring that from a supported enterprise vendor need to be taken into account to make sure that there's a fair and open consideration.
Excellent. David?
So the one thing I would say is cloud is just the appetizer. What's coming very soon is the main course. In fact, in some cases already being experimented, which is really about machine learning, artificial intelligence, and analytics. And again, because of the nature of what public service does, it's essential we have that public trust. And so I think it's both open source in terms of encouraging reuse, having modular reusability across all of public service. But I also think the real key to open source is making open the algorithm. I mean, you already see in California, there is a machine learning algorithm, an AI, that will actually help set bail decisions. And so it takes into account the facts of the case, but it doesn't take into account your height, weight, race, gender, anything like that, which should not matter to your bail decision. And so in some respects, we can make a fairer, more equitable, and more expeditious public service by making things open source with the algorithm. And I think that, to me, is the excitement I have over the next 2 to 3 years.
And then you can use Siri to find a bondsman.
Siri, Watson, whoever you want, or you could even maybe one day actually elect your open source AI as a future commissioner.
Well, I did want to thank the three of you for participating. I know we're super tight on time.
Oh, thank you.
So we're going to
Thanks.
wrap, and thank you guys so much, and thank you all for listening.